So I'd forgotten about the image here showing natural selection. I said there were some beetles, and I think they're just the cutest little dead beetles here, unfortunately. This is the idea of a mutation that made an insect resistant to DDT, and then selecting for resistance in the ongoing populations. So getting into the evidence that Darwin had to support evolution, or that we now have to support evolution, is the fossil record. And so this has been talked about, it showed that idea that there's differences, right, to explain. We can find the oldest fossils are prokaryotic cells, and then we move on to eukaryotic cells, and then the multicellular fossils. And so this idea of time is really important here. Many fossils exist or link early extinct species with species living today. Some of these are the missing links sometimes that we look for. The idea that humans are evolved from apes is another one of those misconceptions. Maybe it's better to say that humans and apes had a common ancestor. And so looking back in the fossil record, we're looking for those common ancestors. As an example, your textbook talks about the evolution of whales and these ancient extinct species that may have existed that led to the evolution of more modern whales that we could see today. And so you could see some commonalities in the body design here and some changes over time. The other idea that Darwin had, and this was because of his travels, is biogeography. So biogeography basically looks at the distribution of different animals and different species of animals. And he notes that on islands that are, or sorry, animals that are on islands that are close together are going to look more alike than organisms that are on very far islands. And so, the idea here is that if you take a look at the Galapagos Islands and the finches on the Galapagos Islands, there's a strong correlation between those, and you can kind of map their connections based on how close they are together. And so he's looking at the traits and forming these ideas. The other piece of evidence here, the other line of evidence, is comparative anatomy. And I'm unclear if the textbook meant to have comparative embryology under comparative anatomy, but comparative anatomy is really talking about the different structures in species. And so homologies are an important concept when we talk about comparative anatomy. So homologies are things in our body designs that we have because we share a common ancestor. And so if you take a look, and this PowerPoint is color-coded where your printout might not be, of the limbs in vertebrate, you can see that these are all homologous structures. So you can track that purple humerus bone in the different structures. So they have a similar root, or their structure similar, even though their function is very different. So this is what we're talking about with homologies, and that's the proof that there's a common ancestor. They came from a similar source, and then evolution took its way. Some homologous structures are vestigial, so they're even harder to see than this forearm or this forelimb structure. Some are vestigial. So you may have noticed on that whale skeleton in the previous slide that there are bones that are vestigial rear limbs. And so this is, again, part of homologous structures. I put in here something that's a little different. Now, this is a little different than evidence, but we can have analogous structures in biology too. And so analogous structures have different evolutionary roots, and yet they've evolved to have a similar function. So the example of that is the human eye and the eye of an octopus. And so they have the same function, even though they have different evolutionary origins. Comparative embryology, like I said, could be considered a part of comparative anatomy, because what comparative embryology is doing is taking a look at the anatomy of early developmental stages in different organisms. So a lot of vertebrates have really common embryonic structures. Believe it or not, you and a chicken at one point looked a whole lot alike. So this is a chicken and this is a human embryo. You had a tail, you had kind of gills, much like a fish or a chicken. All vertebrates have these similar stages in their embryonic development. So basically, all of this evidence, Darwin argues, suggests patterns of descent that can be shown in an evolutionary tree. And so this idea of a tree, or this branching story in evolution, is captured in one of Darwin's notebooks in a sketch that he titled I Think. And so here you can see this kind of evolutionary tree, this tree of life, the tree of evolution, where the branches of the tree are homologous structures that show the link between these different organisms. The fancy word for these evolutionary trees are called cladograms. And so cladograms are really important as we go on and study life, as we move through botany and zoology, and we're being introduced to them here in evolutionary terms. So this would show an evolutionary tree, or a cladogram, of different tetrapods and their closest living relatives. So back here, anything in purple are some important homologies that we can see in the fossil record. And so those homologies represent things that are similar, and then evolution took its course, and the different the groups of vertebrates here evolved differently, or diverted from each other. And so, having four limbs, having eggs not dependent on an aquatic environment. So there could be eggs, or there could be internal development of the offspring. Feathers, another important homology here. And so we'll take a look more at, these trees of life, or the different homologies, and see how the organisms can be thought of being related to each other. The last part of chapter 13 takes it way back in time. And this is, part of the theme of increasing our brain scope of thinking about time here with evolution. So the origin of life on Earth, not the origin of the universe. We needed to have the right stuff around. We needed to have a suitable environment and some energy sources to make life. And so the early life atmosphere was not like it is now. Water vapor, carbon dioxide, way less oxygen than we would have now. The Earth's going to cool, water vapor condenses, which is great. So then we have liquid oxygen. Most of the hydrogen escapes. And then we need these energy sources to bring together all the raw material that we have into something that is an organic molecule. If you think back to chapter 3, this is where hopefully it's going to pay off. If you did the pre-reading for this that I had suggested, I said just Google it. There's a lot of different theories out there, including life coming from outer space, which is one of the hypotheses. I'm going to follow the hypotheses that's outlined in your textbook. And so it's really talking about the energy being on Earth and not coming from outer space. So the summary of changes in protocells, or protobionts, we're not even at the idea here of cells, but something of a precursor to prokaryotic cells. We needed to have monomers created, and then monomers needed to link into polymers. If you remember that from chapter 3 as an important concept, that's why we did it back then. The key polymer that seems to have evolved as one of the first organic molecules is RNA molecule. So RNA is a single-stranded polynucleotide. We talked about it back in chapter 3, like I'd said. It's related to DNA. It's the messenger. So we generally have DNA in our cells working through RNA to make proteins. And also, when I talked about the endosymbiotic hypothesis, that nucleic acids exist in our mitochondria and in chloroplasts. This is also, evidence that this RNA molecule is a really old molecule. So once we get this idea of self-replicating cell precursors, then we can have natural selection working from here. So in your textbook, it outlines Stanley Miller, and he took the theory of the operin and haldane theory, um, and tried to recreate it. So he set up an apparatus with the right gases that were similar to what was surmised was part of the early Earth's atmosphere, and then puts an electrical discharge through. This is the energy source. And so he set it up. He also set up one with no electrical discharge as a control. That's important to have a control in experimental design. And what he found is after a week, he could find amino acids and other organic molecules. So remember, organic molecules are carbon-based. So the first stage is that he did find these organic molecules. After that, he could take a look at how it went on from there. So the other ideas, rather than lightning, we could have hydrothermal vents in the deep sea environment. After we had those organic molecules, then we could have monomers making polymers, polymers linking into these early cell precursors, and this idea of self-replication. So RNA is that important first molecule, and it's probably how life started. More on it, and I think I've already said this, so I've made sure it was written down. So self-replicating molecules is a key thing, and RNA is a common trait of our universal ancestor. And the other idea here that is part of all this is that metabolic pathways can be very common and very old. As an example, the Krebs cycle in aerobic cellular respiration is a really old cycle, and it exists in a lot of organisms. So the idea that natural selection can act on these is that we can have selection for the traits that are going to have differential survival repercussions for those early cell precursors. So we need to have things copying and being passed on from generation to generation, and then have the environment being that selective force. I put this last slide in here just to give us the idea of time. So if you've ever been to Yoho National Park, it's close by, and so maybe you've been there. There's an area called the Burgess Shale, and it has a huge amount of fossils in it, and they're only from this point in time. So again, in this, if you take a look at everything that comes back in time, that endosymbiotic hypothesis, that's where we went into eukaryotic cells, multicellular organisms, it just maps this time on Earth. And so really getting your head around that evolution is a process that takes a long, long time. We will talk more about microevolution and macroevolution and the differences there, because you might be thinking to yourself that you can think of evolution happening faster. But really, oftentimes it's better to get your brain thinking in much longer, bigger time scales.